This is Book 2, Lesson 6, CheesePress Ancient History. As usual, we start off reviewing our vocabulary, and then we have speculation questions, things that we want you to consider before you start reviewing the chapter. So let's get right into it. This is Neolithic Revolution, settling down. So we're approaching the end of the Paleolithic period, speeding through the Mesolithic and then driving directly into the Neolithic, which means what? People are finishing up the large migration period, diversifying, settling into regions, and building more stationary homes. This signifies what change in human behavior? That's right, being able to have things. This is the point in human advancement where they're beginning to not have to move around so much, which means people can have stuff. In earlier periods of human history, hunter-gatherer lifestyles meant that people had to be able to pack up and follow their food sources all year round. This constant travel didn't leave much room for any unnecessary accumulation of things. The lovely development of agricultural techniques means that they've had stable food sources that they didn't have to follow around, which means that in the upcoming periods, humans are going to begin to have permanent structures. People have homes now, which means they can decorate. Not only that, they can develop larger, less portable tools necessary for other technological advancements. 9,000 to 8,000 BCE. Agriculture was a big part of this shift. The Mesolithic period was brief compared to the Paleolithic period, which lasted millions of years, and the Neolithic period, which lasted around 5,000 years. The Mesolithic only lasted around 2,000 years, from approximately 10,000 BCE to 8,000 BCE. This was a transitional stage where people's migration patterns were beginning to slow, and different cultures and practices were starting to develop from their shared ancestors and each other based on region. Agriculture was just starting to be developed at this time. Animal domestication for hunting, dogs, and the preservation of food had still been largely portable things, but all that changes when we get to the Neolithic period. They began upgrading the agricultural techniques pretty quickly. As we discussed earlier, cattle and oxen were first domesticated around 9,000 to 8,500 BCE in the Middle East and Turkey. Oxen have been depicted in human cave paintings for a long time, so it makes sense that they were an animal that got domesticated early. Chickpeas were also being domesticated at the time in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Yes, certain food products are also considered domesticated, and typically the original versions of most foods are very different from the versions we eat today. The wild version of chickpeas ripened in the winter, but humans, more or less, bred and trained chickpeas to grow in the summer to get rid of some of the risk of disease and blight. Yaks were also domesticated around this time in Tibet, as well as cats in Western Asia and the Fertile Crescent. This is a stretch to say we domesticated cats, though, when they truly domesticated themselves. In fact, new evidence shows that cats may have been slowly domesticating themselves and living alongside people since 12,000 BCE, but it's not until around 8,500 to 8,000 BCE that we find clear evidence of cats as companions. Around 8,000 BCE, rice was domesticated in Asia, and potatoes were domesticated in the Andes Mountains. Potatoes were originally bitter due to a compound called glycoalkaloids, which are toxic to humans in large enough concentrations. Potatoes were developed in large varieties because the Andes had a pretty irregular climate, so different types of potatoes were selected by the inhabitants of the region. The domestication of rice is hard to pin down, but it was definitely domesticated by 8,000 BCE. Numerous traits separate wild and domesticated rices, including changes in pericarp color, dormancy, shattering, panicle architecture, tiller number, mating type, and number and size of seeds. At the same time, animal hooves were being boiled down to make glue. This is another example of how most ancient cultures used all parts of the animals that they killed. The cattle that they were raising for meat and skin were the donor animals for these hooves. When the hooves are boiled down, once they dissolve in the water, it leaves a film of glue that is then used to stiffen materials. So they weren't quite sticking things to each other. It was closer to starch at the time. As far as tools go, spindles were invented around 8000 BCE in the Middle East, which means humans were making yarn around this time. Chisels made of flint were also beginning to be used for mining and sculpting in Egypt. Chisels were a more effective method for mining. They didn't have shovels or picks yet, so chisels were definitely a step up. Interlude. We briefly touched on the Neolithic Revolution, which was the drastic switch from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that all humans were practicing to survive up to the point of a more stable and stationary lifestyle. This was largely, though not completely, due to the ending of the Ice Age. This allowed people to cultivate crops, domesticate animals, and build up cities and civilizations, which allowed the population to boom. However, there was no single factor or combination of factors that led people to take up farming in different parts of the world. In the Near East, for example, it's thought that climatic changes at the end of the last ice age brought seasonal conditions that favored animal plants like wild cereals. Elsewhere, such as in East Asia, increased pressure on natural food resources may have forced people to find homegrown solutions, which is why the Mesolithic period, emblematic of finding regional and diverse solutions, was so important for the transition into the Neolithic period. Pottery and textiles were also a part of this revolution. Pottery is known as the first synthetic man-made item. Clay was a readily available resource, being cheap, versatile, and easily found in the ground. The development of pottery was created in the Mesolithic period, which means that it happened independently in different parts of the world at different times. So early styles of pottery vary greatly. The finishing step in making pottery is a process called firing, and for early pottery this was probably done in bonfire pits. Firing must be done at high and controlled temperatures. As you know, it took us an astoundingly long time to figure out fire, and fire had to be mastered before pottery could happen. Uses for clay were discovered the same way most things are discovered, by complete accident. People generally stumble into the discovery or invention of most things. Even when they're searching for answers or specific results, there's generally a lot of, oops, well, that worked, involved in the process. Before the creation of pottery, people transported water in hand-woven baskets, which wasn't optimal, but they used what they had. The rivers they got water from had clay in it, and over time, clay would work itself into the weave of the baskets and settle along the bottom and sides. The baskets would end up lined with dried clay that would take on the shape of the basket, which led to the realization that the clay basket liners could actually be containers. They began to gather and shape the clay themselves, drying it in the sun or on hot ashes, and sometimes even decorated the clay pots. This is how the art of pottery was born, the combination of oops and inspiration. The introduction of pottery generally coincides with the adoption of an agricultural lifestyle. Stationary people needed strong, durable vessels and containers to carry things from where they were to where they needed to be, and the promise that they'll have a place to put a large thing down and won't have to move it for extended periods. However, different cultures developed pottery for different reasons according to their lifestyle. While it may seem like pottery and textiles don't have a lot in common, at this point in history, there is an unexpected intersection. For a long time, textiles were overlooked by archaeologists. The idea of studying textiles was more or less impossible, and the method for doing so was, once again, discovered pretty much by accident. In fact, archaeologists accidentally started studying textiles through the study of clay artifacts. When Eva Andersen Strand, an archaeologist from the University of Copenhagen, decided to take a closer look at small clay discs, she reportedly got a lot of funny looks for it. She stated, "At the time, archaeologists didn't think much about whorls and loom weights as functional objects. Researchers didn't record crucial details like weight and width, and sometimes tools were misclassified. These clay discs were more or less glanced at and discarded before Professor Strand decided to take a closer look. She was able to collect a data set of more than 10,000 different tools, mostly loom weights and spindle whorls, from several sites in Sweden and one in Germany. Her collection includes artifacts from 400 to 1050 CE. Setting aside the fact that the archaeology community overlooked textile making tools for many years, pottery has helped us study textiles in another way. Most actual textiles from the ancient world simply do not exist today due to degradation. This type of preservation methods used to keep textiles from falling apart in the modern day are arduous and expensive. People were not preserving their day-to-day clothes, and both time and the various environments they lived in were actively working to destroy their garments. So, except in very rare cases, most ancient examples of clothing do not exist. However, Eastern archaeologists have found impressions. These impressions came from the fact that fabric was used in the manufacture of pottery. A common method of making a pot was to coil strips of clay in the desired shape, and a wooden paddle would then be used to beat the surface smooth. This paddle would often be wrapped with a cord or with fabric, which would cause the surface to have a decorative texture. This texture offered a few improvements of the finished pot, including a better grip surface and more effective heating for cooking. By studying these textures through making durable impressions of pottery surfaces with modeling clay or dental impression material, archaeologists have been able to determine the types of cord and textiles that were used in making the object. 8000 BCE. Early versions of the kiln were being used around 8000 BCE. These ovens were being used to dehydrate food in the Near East. In the Guerrero cave in Ancash region of Peru, textiles as old as 8000 BCE were found, which were similar to baskets and other containers in the area. Like the baskets, these textile fragments were made with vegetable fibers, incorporating interlacing and knotting woven structures, and they had been dated to the pre-ceramic period. Okay, so that's a lot of domestication, staple foods, and archaeologists finding an appreciation for everyday items from the past. What comes next then? Well, if people are settling down, then it's probably time to get comfortable. And it's only gonna get cozier and cozier from here, which really isn't that hard based on where we started. So that was lesson 6, book 2. CheesePress Ancient History. There's more to the chapter, a couple of videos you can watch. We talk a little bit about ancient mythology, and don't forget to do the exercises at the end of the chapter for the grammar and answer the contemplation questions. Until next time.